So my name's Dan. This company is Archangel Lightworks, which is a laser communications company. And the mission of the company is to 100x the value from imaging satellites in low Earth orbit. So we've just heard, and it's a great intro, about how companies like Open Cosmos are democratizing space, and it's going to be exponentially cheaper and easier to launch satellites. So remember that trend. And before that, we heard about drones, which is a great intro. Because I wasn't quite sure who I'd be talking to today, I was slightly torn how to put together a presentation. Should I be trying to say something useful to people, maybe at the early stages of assessing an idea or moving through into growing a startup, or should I just selfishly talk about the company? I figured I'd try and do both, but whilst I was making my mind up, I decided to start by narcissistically just talking about myself. So my background is in weird aeroplanes, essentially. These kind of aircraft are drones, they're unmanned, and they're called HAPS, which today stands for High Altitude Pseudo Satellites. And essentially, this kind of platform is solar powered, and it flies for theoretically months. In fact, back when I was working at university, which is a while ago now, 2002, I can trace that back to. I was working on a HAPS project for a solar-powered aeroplane that was to fly in the stratosphere. A terrible design. Nowadays, that's reality, and the aircraft you see on the left of the screen there is an Airbus aeroplane, which currently holds the record set and broken this year for 26 days continuous flight in the stratosphere. So this is reality. These trends are real, and they were predictable back in 2002. So in between working on these areas, I worked in a few other areas in space with asteroid deflection, brief stint in Afghanistan, mentoring some startups in Silicon Valley, and strangely racing some motorbikes in China. So the point of slides like this is supposed to be to establish credibility so that you will believe what I'm about to tell you. I would say you should be wary, particularly in today's times of the celebrity tech founder. You should be very wary of survivor's bias. Just because this worked for someone doesn't mean it's necessarily a causal effect, and that that's a good thing to do. So by evidence of that, sometimes for celebrations, let's say graduating or taking some world records with the Zephyr 7 project, not all of my decisions have been perfectly optimized. So you should take everything with a pinch of salt, but I'll try and honestly share some experience with you, and you can decide whether it's useful. So a career in weird aeroplanes, high-altitude pseudo-satellites. Back in 2010, we took some world records, and I founded what then was called Archangel Aerospace. I used to live between Archway and Angel, and I needed a company name that day. So why would I move from that and start a company, or not consulting, working on our own, doing our own thing? Particularly when you see quotes like this. This is a nice, cheerful Elon Musk quote. Starting a company is like eating glass and staring into the abyss. That's motivational. You need a high pain threshold. And I've got to say, bootstrapping a company, particularly if you're working on hard tech, is a bit like optimizing for difficulty. So really, the question should be, why? Because you can guarantee it's going to get difficult at some stage. So unless you have a good reason why and a good way to choose what you do next, you may find yourself posing difficult questions when you can't sleep at night. So back in 2016, we looked at everything we'd achieved and decided to pose the question, what is the highest leverage activity that we should be pursuing? And here's a nice, simple graphic, overly simple really. Things we're good at, things you want to do, and things that people need. So if you work at things you're good at and that you want to do but no one needs, that's called a hobby. If you work at things you want to do and the world needs but you're no good at them, that's called overselling. And generally speaking, if you do things you're good at and that people need but you don't really want to do, that's called slavery. So it's a fairly small intersection, at least in theory. Seems like a good set of questions to ask. We should assess all these options in front of us and pick what that highest leverage activity is. It is, of course, an entirely inadequate set, because actually all of these unconscious drivers for our decisions, already pre-filtered all of the ideas we were looking at in the first place. And we assessed about 12 proof of concepts back in 2016. So actually, all of those problems that we were looking at, they were all big problems, big, global, impactful problems. There was approximately 0% chance that we were about to produce another photo sharing app. That would never have appealed. We needed something that had near-term impact. We couldn't just work on cool technology, but it still needed to have some longer-term significance. We didn't want it to be a flash-in-the-pan experiment, raise some money this year or something, and then disappear into the annals of history. And we wanted to do some stuff with exponential technology so we could leverage some of these pretty amazing tools that are becoming available for people today starting businesses. So all of that really hinged on us being maybe able to predict some trends. Can you predict disruption? And that was the question we posed. So given this is a festival of digital disruption, I thought I'd talk a little bit about that. What is disruption? So here, completely unlabeled graph. Probably the scientists amongst you will be cringing already. So this represents, let's say, global megacorp, established player in some industry, incrementally improving as it moves along. Along comes some new technology, and some other new player enters the market with a big step change in capability. Now, you might be able to see in that, it's a fairly wiggly line, but that trend has already started to peter off. So there's already some inkling that the trend is unsustainable, and maybe that company's headed for hard times. And can we find other examples of this? So here are some fairly basic ones. If we look at this trend, is anyone old enough to remember phones like this, or is it just me? Good, good. So if we look at that trend, what's coming next? Clearly, we're going to end up with fingertip-sized phones, because that's the extrapolation of the trend. That must be what's coming next. But in fact, you could look at that and say, that isn't really sustainable. That trend is due for disruption. And of course, that's what happened. And we moved on to smartphones, which you'll all be very familiar with. And once again, we see the trend reverse. And now, what must be coming next? Well, clearly, we're all going to be carrying around something like that in our pocket or on our backs, and that must be what's coming next. And so you could look at that, and you could say, that's an unsustainable trend. It's ready for disruption. We could predict that there's some disruption coming there. Wearables haven't really started working. We're not that far off from embeddables. You can predict that something will disrupt the smartphone as we know it. And just for fun, does that look like a familiar pattern? And does anyone think we're getting a bigger skull next? Probably not. So, really exciting times to be in, and we thought, yes, we could look ahead, and we could probably try and predict some of these future disruptions. And the one that we picked out was data generation versus data transport. We've just heard from the two previous speakers about the number of drones that are likely to be flying everywhere, and the number of satellites that will be zooming around above our heads. Dig as we might, we're not going to find any more radio spectrum. So the supply of data transport capability versus all of that demand is almost a flat line. And again, just to emphasize the excitement and the opportunity of the times you're living in, the number of connected devices we're seeing on the planet is getting close-ish to the number of neurons in your brain. So that brings us on to Archangel Lightworks. What is it that we do and why? So here is a long list. You don't need to read them all, don't worry. Just notice it's a long list. These are all current, profitable applications of space data today. This is what pushes the demand for companies like OpenCosmos. There's such a large number of useful things and profitable things that you can do with data from space. But all of it is fundamentally limited by the volume of data that you can transport back. It's like the plankton in an ocean ecosystem. The data is the equivalent feedstock for the ecosystem of space companies. So Archangel Lightworks is working on a laser end-to-end data transport service network to 100x the amount of data that we can move down, specifically from low Earth orbit. You may or may not know that something like 90% of the imagery that's taken by satellite around our nice little blue marble of a home, about 90% of that is wasted because there's physically no way to get it down to the ground. And that's just going to get worse. So if you look at the amount of data that a sensor produces, or all of those other uses for the same spectrum, which is actually being pulled away from space, that could be increasing by another order of magnitude or more. And that's been the bottleneck on the space industry for decades. Launch costs have dropped, computers are more capable, but there's no more radio spectrum. Lasers offer a fantastic alternative to that because of the bandwidth that you can achieve. So we can simply dump a lot more data down during the time where a satellite flies over a ground station by laser than we can do by radio. It's the same reason probably your home broadband has switched to fiber optic rather than copper. But we're British, so we're familiar with the problem over in the bottom right-hand side. It doesn't take much cloud to block a laser. So what we are planning to do, and you can see how we've leveraged our existing experience in stratospheric unmanned operations, we are planning to fly high availability, high bandwidth downlinks above the cloud so we can have a continuous downlink via the air to get that data down from space. So it's the convergence of several technologies that are just now coming together at the right time to make this possible. So we can have a continuously flying air relay for lasers from space. Of course, if you have locations where the sky is clear of clouds, so slightly less British locations, then it makes sense to put things on the ground, and of course we would do that anyway. Probably most of you aren't aware of the nature of most low Earth orbits. Most of them are in polar orbits, so they're going north-south around the planet, and they kind of converge together like orange segments near the poles. And what that means is the latitudes that are high and low latitudes, north and south, they're far more useful for these relays, and unfortunately, those are the locations with the most cloud. So the future network for us is going to be a combination of both, but the real competitive edge is leveraging particular UK world-leading experience in those stratospheric platforms. So other drivers, how do we make sure that this isn't just a flash in the pan? And remember, we were looking ahead for some of those trends. Data volume we've spoken about and the limited supply. The spectrum licensing is one of the biggest hurdles to new space missions today. The deep space exploration for asteroid mining, the Martian economy. It really is an incredibly exciting time for you guys to be getting into a new venture or deciding which one of these opportunities you're going to tackle. But all of those will be drivers for laser communications from space. And the last one there, quantum key distribution, cybersecurity, another predictable trend. Is anyone working in quantum tech? That's the usual percentage, approximately 0. So your encryption at the moment is pretty good. Encryption's pretty good. As soon as we have quantum computers, it will all be broken. So the solution to that is quantum key distribution, and that is, without getting into too much of the details now, uses spooky physics, and it's inherently a laser solution. And again, that is a predictable trend. You can plot it, you can see that that's going to happen. So what we're really looking for is exponential demand where supply is flatlined, and we're trying to ride these inevitable trends so we make it less about pure luck and we put ourselves in the right position at the right time. And I'd really counsel you guys to do the same thing. Obviously, we're doing fantastically well, and we have a fantastic team, like everyone would say. But we are filing patents. We have support from large organizations. And very importantly, we have some multi-million euro contracts from customers like the European Space Agency. And that's pretty great to be in as a position for a company that hasn't raised money. Be happy to talk about that some other time, but that is a different topic. So what's next? Well, what's next, much like for other startups, what's next is the team, and growing that team with people who want to be involved in high-tech, exciting startups like Open Cosmos, like us, I'm sure like the other speakers. So what do we need for a team for a startup, and what should you maybe be thinking of if you want to get involved in spaces like this, the space? Well, what we need to grow is a high-performance team, and that means that people have to be ready and excited to work on a high-performance team. That's not the same thing as the unconditional love that your family give you, and it's just okay to try. And it's certainly not the same thing as the sort of ruthless organizations in the caricature of the city. But it is somewhere in between. Startups only work, and they only run to a success and with a good team who will point out if someone is letting the rest of the team down and could do with improving, and will help each other improve. So it's a very performance-driven culture, and the kind of people we look for would therefore match that expectation of performance. People who want to own their future and have an impact on the future of the company. The other point there is judgments. Sorry guys, the only way to get judgment is by cocking it up. The only way to get good judgment usually is by getting something wrong. In the ideal world, you can learn from someone else getting it wrong. But I know at least us and several of the other companies here are recruiting. I'm sure that they'd be interested to give some advice if you're looking to gain some experience in any of these areas, particularly space. And I think that's a good opportunity for me to stop talking.